Hey everyone, and welcome back to the third process walkthrough video for this month's set. So this is the piece that we'll be taking a look at, and without further ado, let's get right into it. So for the process for this piece, it started off quite interestingly as a landscape piece. So as those of you who have seen my stuff for a while now rather, might know, I like to always start off with a vertical piece, because that is, in some ways a better way to present things due to just how well media is viewed nowadays, right? Most phones, just because of scrolling, things in a vertical format usually gets a bit more real estate. So if all other things being equal, things being compositional choices, I like to have the first piece of the set always be vertical, and then I alternate between landscape and vertical orientations. So this being the third piece, you might be wondering, hey, shouldn't this be a vertical one? And indeed, we do end up in a vertical composition, but how did we quite get there? So initially, I'm also going to share a little later on couple of bloopers behind the scenes, additional illustrations that never got finished. But the idea here is that this particular piece was initially conceived as perhaps the second or last piece in the set, and so we had this. I initially planned for this horizontal landscape composition, and here we are. So the idea was that these characters are playing an arcade game, and that was the simple gist of it, right? But I didn't want them to basically do it side by side, because I had already planned for the previous piece to be, this type of side by side configuration, and for the very first piece, we already have a side by side configuration. So maybe the third one, I wanted something a little bit different. And so here we are, right? Where we're one character playing and the other character watching. And this kind of stuff is actually more common than you think. Because, when you go to an arcade with a buddy or a friend, generally speaking, you kind of want to be able to interact with each other and like talk, about the game that's going on. And sometimes we can't find a two-player machine. You have to go for the one-player stuff, like go for a high score mode and all that kind of stuff. And it's kind of like a natural interaction that I thought could be interesting to showcase in this illustration. And so, yeah, here's my justification for the compositional choice. So in the next step, right, as always, I like to go into a little bit of lighting and grayscale to see how things work out. And here we are, right, introducing a bit of simple light sources. For example, one light source is, of course, the screen that the characters are looking at. That creates a slight silhouetting effect because of the light source and how it is presented and its position in depth versus the characters, right, where the light source comes from here and the characters are here, right? And so aside from this particular light source, I also added an additional one in the background to also help support sort of the character's presence over here. And yeah, and so with this basic setup in place, let me introduce to you the main challenge for this particular piece, and that is the color. So color has always been a pretty tough thing for me to deal with personally, because, well, it's just really difficult. I think I'm just not someone that enjoys very vibrant colors on a day-to-day basis, and unless I have a really good reason to use them, like here in the context of an arcade, I usually just kind of stay pretty clear of them. And in a way, I felt like that has been pretty limiting, and that is also partially the reason why I decided to, create this particular set. And that is because I feel like I really just want to have a chance to give it a good attempt, give it a good old try and see how it goes. And I think I'm pretty satisfied with the final result, but without further ado, let's kind of start explaining how the colors work in this particular scene. So for this particular frame or this stage, what I wanted to do was to establish a clear hierarchy of color. For example, I wanted the dominant color in the foreground to be red and yellow, basically very warm colors. And for the background, right, or rather not quite the background, but rather the side that is off screen, for example, we have Let me increase the opacity. So for example here, right, we have the side that is facing the characters in front. And this area is going to be warm, and so are all the surfaces that receive this light source, right? They're all going to be warm, and that is that. However, in order to kind of do the reverse, all the areas here are going to be slightly cooler. And so this is the base concept of lighting that I wanted to do, and or the base setup that I wanted to apply, right? And for this background area over here, I would initially, you know, it was a little bit difficult to figure out how exactly this area is going to go, but eventually I decided on just having it be generally colorful. And the thing about color is that, you know, as I've just spoken about this, right, I'm arranging things into groups. Okay, group A is warm, group B is cool, and this is how we're going to plan around them and all that. You know, that's great. But the thing about real world locations like arcades is that inherently there's going to be a bit of chaos in the color just because of how colorful everything is by design, right? Because if we draw everything, or if I draw everything my usual style, doesn't look like an arcade, right? It looks like a really strange, surreal dream of an arcade with a lack of color. So here, I kind of embrace the chaos, right? For example, here, of course, right, I try to keep things a bit more organized with the red and yellow, red and black, and white, very contained color scheme. But for this region here, I decided to go a little bit wilder with varying colors, right? And this, I think, is an important step, or rather important moment for me, because rarely do I kind of find a chance to draw or use a lot of color, simply because the scenes that I draw often don't require very vibrant lighting color, to be precise, right? A lot of times I do use different local colors. There's a variety, there's a set of vibrant local colors, but oftentimes they're overshadowed by the lighting, which is just the way I like to do things. It's kind of my visual style, my preferred method of presentation. But in this particular piece, or rather in this particular set, the use of colored light is something that is really sort of new to me, right? Of course, I'm familiar with the good old moonlight and sunlight, you know, a little bit of warm accent light here and there. That's all fine and dandy, but with the context of an arcade, suddenly you have a lot of these new colors that you have to handle, and finding a good balance for them is actually really, really tough. So let's see how I continue working on this particular piece. So next, as I finally decided after doing a bit more planning that this was going to be the third piece in the set, and I wanted to see if we could do it in vertical format, and the answer is, or was, fortunately, yes. Actually, the vertical format I feel works really nicely with this particular piece because of how things line up, right? For this particular composition, the characters are sort of in the middle, they're pretty contained, they're close together, and having a vertical format to do this basically doesn't really cut away much of the characters, but rather shows a bit more of them, if anything. And another extra thing it allows us to do is to further explore the close perspective, right? For example, in this particular horizontal frame, we don't really see this area here below, right? How this area here looks, we don't really get information on that. But in a vertical format, we can get to see edges that are even closer to the camera from directly above, and we kind of can take a look at how they look and feel, and overall the effect is to help bring us further into the scene. And in the vertical, or rather in the landscape format, it's definitely serviceable, it's fine, but it lacks that little bit of extra dynamic angles or POV that this particular vertical format can help give us, and hence the transfer to the vertical. And here I continue to explore the colors. Basically, one important step here I wanted to show you is also the extension of the canvas upwards. One issue that I definitely have here is how extending the canvas upwards sort of brings the focus a little bit away from this character's head, because I feel like this particular composition helps the character fill the frame a little bit better than this one, where the character is a little bit below. But what it does allow us to do is to show a bit more of the arcade. And for example, my initial intention here was to just kind of show the background of the arcade, right? Like, it's a really, really big place, so all we see in the distance aren't like very small details or stuff like that, but we see like the general lights essentially illuminating a very big cavernous hall. So maybe this is kind of one of those really big arcades, entertainment centers, in a dedicated mall, stuff like that, right? Just a very big place that I thought could be interesting to draw. And so this was kind of the premise of it moving forward. Similar to as I mentioned before, I wanted to keep the colors in control, but also with a good amount of variance. And hence, as you can see here, I have basically green, yellow, red, blue, a lot of the primary colors. We also threw away some purple, a little bit of pink, and warm colors as well as the cool blues. Well, this blue is more the warm side, but you get what I mean. In general, a nice variance of colors, and you might notice that for this particular portion, I'm not dictating things really hard, like you have to use this color, use that color, because to be honest with you, a lot of this process for this piece is also made up on the spot. Like I just figured out, okay, so this color kind of looks good here. Green is a unique color in this setting, so why not we use it as a highlight to draw a bit more attention and stuff like that. Really intuitive stuff, but not quite as organized as I would usually have it, right? Which might contribute to the slight messiness and not quite optimal setup that we have. So that is definitely one of my, regrets for the piece. Like I wasn't quite able to execute it to the best of my ability, just because I wasn't familiar enough with the colors, how to work with them, and that has been a really big challenge for me in this overall set as a whole. However, in order to eventually get good at something, you have to start doing it. And yeah, this has been a pretty fun opportunity to work on this piece as well. Another thing that I did also learn a lot about is, well, perspective. So perspective is something that I talk about really often here on Patreon and, in general, right, in the books. But I always say perspective is important because, put very simply, you really need to be able to have a consistent POV shared by all aspects of your image, of your composition. Because if you're looking at object A from angle A and suddenly you're looking at object B from angle B, that's something wrong, right? These things shouldn't be in the same illustration, right? You should have a consistent POV. And this is really the key behind perspective. And the difficult part for this particular piece is that, in addition to all the color and stuff, the characters themselves also sort of undergo this influence from perspective, right? Because the near side of the character is significantly visually larger than the far side of the character, right? And for example, her arm here is even bigger in visual scale, whereas the head is a bit smaller, with the face being even smaller yet because it's a bit further away, right? And this relationship carries on to the character here, how big their torso should be, how small their waist should be, and all these things can be really difficult to figure out early on, because, well, perspective is a beast, and it really takes years and years of even more practice to, get closer to mastering it. But for now, one of the things that I do try to sort of remind myself is, at the very least, have a good idea of what is closer and what is further away. So, for example, if we have a character and we know that the character's head is closer, for example, because, well, our camera is sort of nearby, and the distance between the head and our POV and the distance between the hand and our POV is there. There's difference. With the head being closer, then the head should be slightly bigger than the hand here, right? Despite the head being, say, further away in this particular axis. Let me use a brighter color. In this particular axis, the head might be a bit further away, but in the vertical axis, which in this particular situation is much closer, then this particular one might take priority, and then we have the head that is slightly bigger. And for me, honestly, a lot of this is done with eyeballs. As I mentioned, I used a little bit of logic to sort of figure out which elements should be bigger, which elements should be smaller. But ultimately, at this stage, I feel like the most effective way is to just keep practicing and using your eyeball to kind of tell when things are off, right? So here things are kind of off because the character's head is really big compared to her body. And the reason why this is off is because she is further away from the POV than our foreground character, right? So within this further element or this further subject, the variance in proportion should be smaller because the object as a whole is further away from our POV. And so while this may not always be the case because you have something that is still pretty close, right, even though it's further away than something that's literally point blank, in this case I wanted to at least show the relationship, so I wanted this character in the background to be a little bit more proportionate, and hence my choices here to sort of adjust the proportions just a tad bit. And now at this stage, as you can see, if you recall this design from a couple of sets ago where I drew this character solo, this was the same dragon jacket design that I saved from earlier, which really helps honestly at this stage, because man, I'm really tired from drawing all this. By no means is this a complaint or me whining, but you know, to be realistic, right? Having these kind of things saved for future use, especially when you're drawing a recurring character, it's really, really helpful, right? It's really helpful to have a file that just has a flat image of this, and then you can just use it wherever you need, and that is absolutely amazing. And I'm super glad I actually remembered to do this. And yeah, and so after this stage comes the pain, in a way, right? It's not too much pain, but it's a little bit tedious, right? For example, filling all these little fonts, drawing these scan lines, drawing all these, you know, the card readers for the machines in detail, stuff like that. You know, adding a bit of interesting texture to the background, like this kind of grilled fence that we saw in image number 2, or picture artwork number 2. And then, you know, small things like that in the background, in addition to actual fonts being used for the machines, the arcade gaming machines titles, some pretty simple placeholder-ish stuff, because I really ran out of energy by this point. And hopefully at some point in time we'll be able to remaster this, or maybe I'll just find another chance to draw another arcade somehow. But so far it's not too terrible, but at this point, as you can tell, it's not as high effort or as amazing as it could be. So, you know, you have to forgive me for that. But still, right, I still try to draw a couple of signs manually, like this one over here. And yeah, and of course, using older pieces as as games start screens. So this one's pretty interesting because, you know, it just kind of fits pretty well, right? And it's just kind of fun to include it and get a load of free detail over here, which is always nice to have when you're drawing and you're really tired and kind of gassed out at this point. But still, I want to showcase stuff like this in the foreground. Seeing this from above, for example, are all pretty cool aspects of this kind of extreme perspective, which can be really challenging, but it's also kind of worth it as well. So, well, feel free to give it a try. Although I must say this is very challenging. And yeah, and the last thing I do want to mention is that I replaced this particular area here, this blank space, with a mirrored wall. So have these like brushed metal panels that kind of reflect the background in a sort of diffuse manner, which I thought was pretty interesting. I decided to throw it in. And yeah, this is pretty much it for this piece. So the main focus here is really trying to manage the perspective well enough to keep things legible, as well as using colors in a controlled manner, but still knowing that we need to have enough of them to make things count. So yeah, so this was the challenge of this piece, and I hope you have found this little process breakdown helpful. And as always, feel free to ask any questions you have in the comments of this particular videos specific to this piece, and I'll try my best to answer them. Yeah, and once again, well, it's not quite the end yet because there is one more video for the set, and please look forward to that. But otherwise, as always, thank you for your support.